Imagine a morning in Jerusalem, near the end of the 12th century. The sun has just risen above the eastern horizon. Light spills over the ancient stone walls, bathing the holy city in its familiar pale gold. Church bells ring with steady rhythm, just as they have for nearly a century, ever since the first Crusaders took the city by blood and fire. Jerusalem wakes, beginning another fragile day of existence suspended between desert, faith, and hostility. Inside the palace, a young king prepares for the day. You are 16 years old. You are the king of Jerusalem. But when you reach out your hand, you cannot feel what you are holding. Beneath the carefully polished iron glove, the nerves in your hand are dying one by one. There is no sharp pain, no warning, only a quiet numbness, like land slowly reclaimed by the sea until nothing remains. Your body is decaying while you are still alive. Your name is Baldwin IV. Before you became a dying king, you were once a child whom death began touching very early. There was no dramatic moment to announce it, no prophecy spoken in a temple. It began with something so small, most people would ignore it. A scorching afternoon in the palace courtyard, where royal children played under the distracted watch of adults. A joke that went too far, a child's hand clamped onto your arm, fingernails dug deep into your skin. For any other child, there would have been an instinctive cry, a reflex without thought, but you did not cry. You only turned your head and looked at your playmate with confusion, as if you did not understand why the game had suddenly stopped. You did not pull your arm away. You did not flinch. There was no sign that you had just been hurt. Nearby stood your tutor, a man who had read enough to know that courage does not erase pain, and that a child who feels no pain is not a good sign. He stepped closer, unhurried, but with a cold sensation creeping up his spine. He pulled back your sleeve. Beneath the fabric were red scratches, some already bleeding. He touched your skin lightly. You did not react. He pressed harder. Still nothing. No pain, no fear, nothing at all. That moment was never recorded in any chronicle. No historian wrote it down. Yet it was there that the fate of Baldwin and of Jerusalem began to turn in another direction. In the 12th century, leprosy was not merely an illness, it was a sentence, a sign that God had turned away. Those afflicted were not only destroyed physically, they were cast out by society and religion alike. They were driven from communities, forced to wear bells to warn others that death was near. They lived on the margins of the human world. But Baldwin could not be cast out. You were a prince, the heir to the throne of Jerusalem. And so the court chose the most dangerous path of all to pretend that nothing had happened. There was no official declaration, no public acknowledgement. No one stood in the great hall and said that the man who would wear the crown was slowly dying from within. Instead, physicians came and went at unnoticed hours. Secret meetings were held among clergy in small chapels, candlelight flickering across anxious faces. They prayed, they argued. They tried to convince themselves that this was only a trial sent by God, not a curse, but deep down, none of them truly believed it. The queen looked at her son with a fear she could share with no one. Baldwin still walked normally, still laughed and spoke, still wore the appearance of a healthy child. But she saw what others tried not to see: the faint slowness in his movements, the wounds that appeared without any memory of pain. In the long nights, when the palace fell silent, one question haunted her again and again: could a king marked by God truly protect Jerusalem? No one answered that question. The court continued in silence, hoping that silence might last longer than the disease. Baldwin grew up inside that atmosphere of concealment. No one ever told you the whole truth, but no explanation was necessary. Children sense fear in their own way. You notice the eyes that lingered too long, conversations that stopped abruptly when you entered a room, the excessive care in every touch, as if your body were something fragile. Then you realized it yourself. Sensation left you little by little. First the fingertips, then the toes, the farthest parts of the body, where life lets go first. You were injured without knowing it, burned without realizing, until you saw the skin change color. You dropped objects because you could no longer feel the moment you let go. Your body was still there, but control was not. And with that loss came an irreversible understanding. You knew your time was limited. You would not grow old. There would be no sons to succeed you. There would be no long future in which to correct mistakes. What other princes took for granted were, for you, possibilities that would never exist. You had no future. You had only the present. That knowledge changed you in ways those around you did not yet recognize. When someone knows with certainty that death is not a distant possibility, but an inevitability, fear slowly loses its power. You no longer feared pain because you could no longer feel it. And gradually, you no longer feared death either. The court could hide the illness. The clergy could whisper in the shadows. But truth does not need proclamation to exist. It lived in every heavy step Baldwin took, in every wound that did not hurt, in every morning you woke knowing your body had abandoned you a little more. Baldwin was a child, dying on a throne. And because you accepted death so early, you were about to become the most dangerous thing the world around Jerusalem had ever faced, a king with nothing left to lose. When Baldwin learned to live alongside staring down death within his own body, the world beyond Jerusalem was changing as well, quietly, relentlessly, and utterly indifferent to the fate of a boy who wore a crown. The first Crusade, the great achievement that had given birth to this kingdom, was no longer living memory by 1177. It belonged to the dead. It was a story old men told their grandsons by flickering firelight, voices heavy with pride and nostalgia. The knights who had climbed Jerusalem's walls through seas of blood in 1099 now survived only as names carved into stone. The generation that had taken Jerusalem was gone, and the generation that followed had grown up facing a far harsher truth. The kingdom they inherited was not an unbreakable fortress, but a fragile construct, surviving only because of conditions beyond its control. Jerusalem, along with the other Crusader states scattered along the Levantine coast, had never truly been strong. They were not populous, not rich in resources. They possessed no strategic depth. The only thing that had kept them alive for nearly 8 decades was the division of the enemies around them. For many years, the Muslim world was not a unified force. Great cities and dynasties distrusted one another. Cairo opposed Damascus. Aleppo rivaled Mosul. Emirs were consumed by struggles for power, land, and titles, leaving none with the strength or the patience to concentrate their full force on crushing the Christian outposts along the coast. The Crusader states did not win during that time. They merely survived in the gaps left by chaos. But by the time Baldwin ascended the throne, those gaps were beginning to close. News from the east and the south was no longer fragmented, no longer a series of minor clashes between Muslim lords. It began to assemble into a single, frightening picture. A new order was forming. A single will was drawing scattered pieces into one coherent whole. Division, the very thing that had protected Jerusalem longer than any stone wall, was coming to an end. In the palace halls, maps were spread across cold stone tables. Advisors pointed without needing many words. Everyone could see it. To the south lay Egypt, to the east and north, Syria, where these lands had once been opposing worlds. They were now beginning to move in the same rhythm. Jerusalem was no longer standing between spears pointed at one another. It was becoming the target. And while the outside world was gathering strength, there was little sign of an equal preparation within Jerusalem itself. Lords argued over privileges. Military orders competed for influence. Each faction believed its greatest threat lay in its political rivals, not beyond the distant horizon. Jerusalem still prayed as it always had. Church bells still rang. Pilgrims still arrived and knelt before holy relics. But faith, no matter how strong, could not replace an army, and the army was thinning. Baldwin saw it clearly, even as his body betrayed him day by day. He understood that Jerusalem was not facing a sudden crisis. It was sliding steadily toward an unavoidable point, like a ship continuing toward hidden rocks, while the crew argued over who had the right to stand at the bow. The rising power in the east was not a passing storm. It did not come to raid and withdraw. It came with clear purpose, abundant resources, and long vision. Jerusalem, in its eyes, was not the center of the world. It was an obstacle, a symbol that needed to be erased. The distance between the two sides was becoming impossible to ignore. On one side stood a small kingdom, sustained by memories of old victories. On the other rose a growing power, driven by faith, wealth, and patience. The age was turning. Jerusalem still stood, as it had for centuries, but this time, not every wind would pass harmlessly by. Some winds carried the promise of a storm, and when the storm came, it would not ask who was ready. Baldwin, the young king who was dying, understood that the world would not wait for him. The movement of the age did not care about illness, about youth, or about whispered prayers in the night. It moved forward regardless, crushing whatever stood in its path. Jerusalem was approaching the moment when everything would be decided, not by memory, not by hope, but by steel, blood, and choices from which there would be no retreat. While Jerusalem was still asking itself whether it had enough time to survive one more year. In the East, time was not wasted on such questions. There, a man had finished preparing. His name was Saladin. In 1177, Saladin was 40 years old. He was no longer an apprentice, but not yet a fading veteran. He stood at the most dangerous point in a man's life when experience, health, and ambition coexist in the same body. He had made enough mistakes to avoid repeating them, and won enough victories to believe he understood how the world worked. Saladin did not emerge from nothing. He was the product of decades of chaos in the Muslim world. Before him, leaders had spoken endlessly of holy war, of unity, of sweeping the Western invaders from sacred lands. But they failed again and again, because they could not overcome the simplest obstacle of all themselves. Egypt opposed Syria. Damascus distrusted Aleppo. Great cities regarded one another as mortal enemies. That very division allowed the Crusader states to survive far longer than any military logic would permit. Saladin brought that era to an end. He began with Egypt, the land of the Nile, where grain never ran out and gold flowed steadily into the treasury. Controlling Egypt did not merely mean having an army. It meant having the ability to sustain one, the ability to pay soldiers, enforce discipline, and wage war not for weeks, but for years. Then he turned north. Syria was not conquered in a single battle. It was gathered piece by piece through alliances, pressure, and agreements for which the other side had no better alternative. When Damascus and Aleppo fell into the same orbit, the world around Jerusalem changed completely. For the first time in generations, Egypt and Syria no longer turned their backs on one another. They turned their faces toward Jerusalem. From the banks of the Nile to the upper reaches of the Euphrates, Saladin controlled a space large enough to crush any Crusader kingdom by sheer weight alone. He had money, manpower, and logistics. More importantly, he had time, the one thing Jerusalem did not. Saladin's army was not a crowd gathered by temporary zeal. It was a professional force. At its core stood the Mamluks, Warriors trained from childhood to fight, ride, and kill as instinct. Around them moved desert cavalry fast, flexible, intimate with terrain, and mobile warfare. Behind them came heavy infantry, masses of men capable of enduring fatigue, hunger, and heat beyond what Western soldiers could imagine. This was a war machine that could move across the desert like a tide. And Saladin understood exactly what he held in his hands. When reports from Jerusalem reached him, they caused no anxiety. They confirmed what he already believed. On the other side stood a small kingdom, torn apart by internal politics, ruled by a leper king slowly dying on his throne, Baldwin IV. In Saladin's eyes, the imbalance was so extreme it scarcely required discussion. On one side stood a healthy man at the height of his power, leading a newly unified empire. On the other stood a teenager who could not feel his own body, wrapped in bandages and ritual to conceal an obvious truth. Saladin did not hate Baldwin, nor did he fear him. In his worldview, health and bodily wholeness were signs of divine favor. A leper king was proof of the opposite. Baldwin, by that logic, was not a chosen opponent. He was a sign that the kingdom of Jerusalem had entered the final stage of its life cycle. Saladin regarded Baldwin as a man already dead. A chapter about to close, a temporary obstacle that time itself would erase. That certainty shaped the way Saladin prepared for the coming war. He did not plan for a decisive duel with a military genius. He planned for an overwhelming advance, a campaign designed to roll across Crusader lands like a flood, breaking everything in its path, and ending with the recapture of Jerusalem, a goal the Muslim world had awaited for nearly a century. In Saladin's mind, there was no room for surprise. He had unified Egypt and Syria. He commanded the largest army in the region. He possessed legitimacy, resources, and the support of the Muslim world. Logic, numbers, and history all stood on his side. And so, when Saladin looked toward Jerusalem in 1177, he did not see an enemy. He saw a foregone conclusion. He did not know that on the other side stood a boy who had accepted death long ago, and a person like that does not obey the logic of empires, of numbers, or of endings that seem impossible to avoid. When Saladin made his decision, everything moved very quickly. There were no prolonged councils, no endless debates among commanders. To him, this was not a gamble, but the obvious next step in a plan prepared long ago. Jerusalem had existed long enough. Its time was over. And so Saladin mobilized the full army of Egypt, not a reconnaissance force, not a probing raid. He brought the true weight of an empire, around 26,000 men, a number which, in the 12th century, and under the brutal logistical conditions of the Middle East, was the equivalent of moving an entire city across the desert. At the center of the formation stood the Mamluks, the finest warriors Saladin possessed. They were not seasonal levies. They were professional soldiers, trained from childhood to ride, shoot, and kill as a natural reflex. Their discipline did not come from emotion, but from habits repeated over an entire lifetime. Surrounding the Mamluks were thousands of light cavalry from desert tribes. These men moved fast, struck and withdrew, and were at home in both the terrain and the crushing heat. They were the eyes and wings of the army, able to spread across dozens of miles, cutting communications and sowing fear long before the main force arrived. Behind them came the Sudanese infantry, heavy, resilient masses of men used to absorb blows and hold ground. They were not fast, but they did not break. They were born to endure what others could not. Alongside the army moved a vast logistical train. Camels carried water, food, weapons, and tents. An entire war machine designed not to stop, not to rely on supplies from the land it was about to destroy. When this army crossed the southern border of the Kingdom of Jerusalem, the world of those who lived there changed in a matter of days. Small villages scattered across the fields had no time to understand what was happening. Before any official warning arrived, smoke was already rising on the horizon. Roofs burned. Granaries were emptied by fire. Livestock was slaughtered or driven away. Those who did not flee in time were killed or dragged off into captivity. News spread faster than any army. Refugees flooded the roads leading toward Jerusalem and Ascalon. They carried children, whatever possessions they could hold, and stories broken by panic. No one spoke of strategy. No one spoke of defense. They spoke only of one thing. Again and again, the Egyptian army was coming, in enormous numbers. No one could stop it. A sense of apocalypse settled over the land. The small fortresses along the border were either abandoned or held by token garrisons. They did not have the numbers to resist, nor the orders to do anything beyond locking their gates and waiting. Against 26,000 men, isolated resistance meant only pointless death, and amid all this chaos, the most brutal truth slowly emerged. The kingdom of Jerusalem barely had an army. Most of the strongest Crusader forces, the great lords, the heavy infantry, and the majority of the Knights of the Templars and Hospitallers had marched north. They were engaged in a campaign in Syria, acting on false intelligence that Saladin would attack from that direction. They had left just as the real enemy advanced from the south. The back door of the kingdom had been left open. Jerusalem, the holy city fought over by the world, was now nearly empty of soldiers. The stone walls still stood, but the men strong enough to stand upon them with sword and shield did not. Saladin knew this. He did not stop to besiege every fortress. He did not waste time on small objectives. The massive army continued forward like an unstoppable current, leaving behind scorched land and roads littered with corpses. The goal was not to fight a glorious battle. The goal was to break the kingdom at its roots. As columns of smoke drew closer to Jerusalem, panic began to seep into the very center of power. Alarm bells rang. Messengers rode in desperation. But no miracle appeared. No great army returned to save the day. Jerusalem stood there, facing the oncoming wave, with its ancient walls and very few men to defend them. This invasion was unlike the ones before. It was not a threat. It was not a test. It was a sentence being carried out. And, to the south, in the city of Ascalon, the young leper king listened as reports arrived, one after another. Each village burned was another heartbeat of the kingdom being crushed. Each refugee at the gates was proof that time had run out. 26,000 men were advancing, and nothing, at least by every logic of war, could stop them. Ascalon stood along the coast, a massive stone fortress guarding the road from Egypt into the kingdom of Jerusalem. For generations, it had been called the Southern Gate, a gate that, if held shut, meant the kingdom still had hope, and if broken, meant everything behind it would collapse. When news of the invasion arrived, Baldwin was already there. He was not in Jerusalem. He was in Ascalon, trying to do what his body increasingly refused to allow rest. The pain did not come as sensation, but as exhaustion. Fatigue sank deep into bone, into lungs, into every breath. Each morning was a negotiation with his own body. Could he still stand today? Could he still mount a horse within the cool stone chambers of the fortress? Baldwin listened as reports arrived without pause. Villages burned, roads filled with fleeing people. The Egyptian army was so large no one could count it. Each messenger carried another fragment of the same story, and the story grew shorter each time, because there was nothing new left to add. The storm had made landfall. Generals and advisors gathered around him, men hardened by war, accustomed to weighing lives on maps and numbers. They looked at Ascalon, then out beyond its thick, towering walls. This fortress was strong, nearly impregnable if it had enough of food and water. And it had both. Their advice was clear. Hold fast. Stay in Ascalon. Seal the gates. Wait. Wait for the Crusader army in the north to realize its mistake and return. Wait for Saladin to be forced into a prolonged siege he did not want. Wait for the balance to shift. By logic, it was the only reasonable decision. Baldwin listened to everything. He did not interrupt. He did not object. He did not show anger. He knew these men were not cowards. They were simply doing what war usually rewards caution. With so few troops at hand, with a king who was dying, hiding behind stone walls was the only way to prolong the kingdom's existence. But while the advisors spoke of maps and time, outside those walls, Saladin had already made his own choice. He did not stop at Ascalon. Instead of besieging the fortress, instead of wasting time and manpower on a difficult siege, Saladin did what a man utterly confident in victory would do. He left behind a small force, just enough to block the gates, and continued marching north. He bypassed Ascalon. It was a cold message, sent straight into the fortress. Saladin did not need to defeat Baldwin. He only needed to go around him. He did not need to take the fortress. He only needed to leave it standing, powerless, while the kingdom behind it was torn apart piece by piece. From the walls of Ascalon, black columns of smoke could be seen rising in the distance. Each column was a village, a family, a fragment of Jerusalem disappearing. The soldiers on watch needed no messenger to understand what was happening. They could see it with their own eyes, and they knew there was nothing they could do. Inside the thick walls, Ascalon became a cage, safe but suffocating. Streets filled with soldiers and refugees. The air grew heavy with sweat and fear. Arguments sharpened with each passing hour that brought no good news from the north. To hold fast meant abandoning Jerusalem, and Baldwin understood that before anyone dared to say it aloud. If he stayed here, Saladin would not turn back. He would keep advancing. He would reach Jerusalem, a city with almost no defenders left. The holy city would fall, while its king remained safe behind stone walls, waiting for an army that might arrive too late. That was the price of caution. Baldwin could not accept that price. He looked at the map. The distance from Ascalon to Jerusalem was not great, but with a small force and an enemy many times larger, that distance became an abyss. He understood every calculation, every number, every reason to do nothing, but he also understood something his advisors, no matter how intelligent, could not feel as he did. He had no time. His body was collapsing day by day. He could not prolong the war. He could not wait for a better opportunity. If Jerusalem fell, everything he was trying to protect through his own painful, continued existence would end within weeks. And when you know that your future was taken from you long ago, you do not make decisions the way others do. Baldwin recognized Saladin's fatal mistake, not in grand strategy, but in psychology. Saladin had left an enemy behind, an enemy he believed no longer capable of danger, a leper boy, trapped in a fortress, assumed to choose safety. Saladin was wrong. Staying in Ascalon was safe, but it was the safety of slow surrender. Leaving Ascalon was suicide, but suicide with a chance to change fate. Baldwin understood that there was only one way to save Jerusalem, not by defending, not by waiting, but by doing what no one believed could happen, leaving the fortress, attacking. Not to defeat Saladin's entire army, but to force him to turn back, to transform a certain victory into a crisis, to do the one thing Saladin could not imagine: a dying king with a tiny force, actively hunting an army many times his size. When Baldwin announced his decision, the room fell silent. No one cheered. No one objected at once. The men around him simply looked at one another, because they all understood what this meant. This was not a counterattack. This was a gamble where losing meant immediate annihilation. But they also understood that doing nothing would lead to the same ending, only more slowly. Baldwin, The young king, who was already exhausted, looked out beyond the walls of Ascalon one last time. He knew that once the gates opened, there would be no return. No contingency plan, no refuge, only the coastal road, the dust, and a massive army somewhere ahead. The decision had been made. From this moment on, Baldwin was no longer a king hiding in a fortress. He became a hunter, and that alone would shatter the entire logic of the war to come. The gates of Ascalon did not open to the sound of victory trumpets. They opened in silence. There were no cheering crowds, no grand ceremony, only the sound of metal striking metal, hooves scraping stone, and faces that knew exactly that they were leaving the last place of safety behind. As the heavy gates slid apart, sunlight poured into the narrow street inside the fortress, and with it came the cold weight of a decision from which there was no return. Baldwin had done everything that could be done within the little time he had. He summoned everyone who could ride a horse and carry a weapon. Rank did not matter. Birth did not matter. Court knights, local cavalrymen, men who had guarded gates, escorted pilgrims, survived skirmishes on forgotten roads. He stripped soldiers from Templar garrisons, leaving behind fortresses that were already undermanned. When the final count was taken, the number was clear and unforgiving. Around 500 cavalry. Even with infantry and retainers following behind, the force was so small it was nearly meaningless against an army of 26,000. But Baldwin was not seeking balance. He was seeking a blow. At the center of this fragile formation stood the most dangerous men Jerusalem still possessed, the Knights Templar. Leading them was Odo of Saint Amand, Grand Master of the Order. He was rigid, uncompromising, and incapable of retreat. His knights had sworn never to withdraw unless outnumbered 3-1. Today, they were outnumbered 50-1. Odo did not object. He did not argue. He did not ask what the contingency plan was. For him, the king's command, combined with the presence of the enemy, was enough. The men in white cloaks, marked with black crosses, tightened their reins, checked sword and shield, and took their places as if preparing for an ordinary drill. What pushed this march beyond the realm of pure tactics was what they carried with them, the true cross. In the hands of the Bishop of Bethlehem, encased in gold and jewels, was the wood they believed Christ himself had been crucified upon. To modernize, it was a relic. To a 12th century knight, it was physical proof that God was not watching from afar. He was present. The presence of the true cross transformed the march into something else entirely. It was no longer merely a military gamble. It became a desperate holy war, a pilgrimage led straight into death. If they won, it was God's will. If they died, that too was God's will. Fear was replaced by acceptance. At the front of the column, Baldwin prepared to mount his horse. This was the moment when his body betrayed him most clearly. Riding a war horse required strength, balance, and sensation things. Baldwin was steadily losing. He could not feel the reins in his hands. He could not tell how tightly he was gripping them. Servants had to help him into the saddle, adjust his posture, and bind the reins around his wrists so they would not slip from fingers that no longer obeyed. Baldwin did not protest. He understood that this image, if witnessed, would symbolize weakness, a king bound to his horse. But he also understood that no symbol was stronger than the fact that he was still here, still mounted, still leading, even as his body collapsed. Beneath armor and silk, bandages kept skin from tearing under constant friction. The heat of the coastal plain pressed down on everything. For a healthy man, it was already torment. For Baldwin, it was torture, but he did not complain. He could not feel all of the pain, and he did not allow himself to stop. When the column began to move, it did not turn toward Jerusalem. It turned north, along the coastal road, blue sea to the left, burning land to the right. No rear guard, no resupply, no plan of retreat. Each step carried them farther from Ascalon and closer to Saladin's army. The men riding with Baldwin understood this perfectly. None of them believed they were marching toward a fair fight, but they also knew that turning back was no longer an option. If they returned, it would only be to watch Jerusalem fall from a distance. Better to move forward. Baldwin rode at the front, surrounded by Templar knights. To those following behind, the sight was both terrifying and inspiring. They were not following an invincible hero. They were following a dying boy who knew that every passing hour brought him closer to an inevitable end, and that was precisely what made him dangerous. Saladin believed Baldwin would remain in Ascalon, believed the sickly boy would choose safety, believed the fortress at his back had neutralized that minor threat. Saladin could not imagine this scenario, a leper king with 500 cavalry, willingly leaving stone walls to hunt an army many times his size. The small force moved fast. They did not linger. They pushed their horses to the limit. They knew speed was the only thing that could compensate for numbers. Dust rose behind them, a thin trace for anyone perceptive enough to notice. But no one noticed. Saladin was advancing toward Jerusalem, confident and unhurried, with an army already beginning to spread out to plunder and rest. In his mind, the war was decided. Ascalon had been left behind, along with a king no longer capable of posing danger. Meanwhile, 500 men were riding out from the gates, carrying a king bound to a saddle, a relic believed to hold the power of God, and a resolve no longer constrained by the fear of survival. This march had no retreat, and as they moved forward, the world was sliding toward the moment when every logic of war was about to be broken. Saladin did not know that he was being watched. His army continued marching north, crossing lands already stripped and burned, moving toward a Jerusalem that was nearly empty. There was no pressure, no sense of urgency. In Saladin's mind, the only real danger had been left behind, trapped inside the stone walls of Ascalon, and so discipline began to loosen when the massive army reached the area of Montgisard, near Tel el-Jezza. It was no longer a tightly held fighting force. This was not a formation prepared for battle. It was an army marching in the confidence of early victory. Units were stretched thin, groups of soldiers scattered to search for water, to plunder, to rest. Many removed their armor to escape the heat. Horses were led instead of ridden. Weapons were stacked on supply wagons. They were crossing a wadi, a dry riverbed, where the terrain forced the army to compress into narrow passages, space choked by wagons, stolen livestock, tents, and men. It was the most dangerous moment for any army. But Saladin was unconcerned. No one in his host believed that any force existed bold enough or foolish enough to strike them now. Every report said the same thing. Baldwin was trapped in Ascalon. The main Crusader forces were in the north. There was no one behind them. Meanwhile, to the south, 500 cavalry were advancing in silence. They moved fast, driving their horses to the limit. The wind blew against them, carrying back the dust of Saladin's army. Before they saw the enemy, they smelled it, the stench of sweat, horse dung, smoke, and iron, the unmistakable sign of a vast army very close ahead. Scouts returned with news that made the entire column slow. Not a small detachment, not a rear guard. Saladin's entire army lay directly ahead, unformed, unready, unaware. This was the only chance. Baldwin reined in his horse. The small force gathered behind him. Exhausted faces, coated in dust, looked forward to where the land opened into a sea of men. There was no time for complex plans, no time for refined tactics. Only one choice remained: strike now. Strike with everything, and do not stop. Baldwin dismounted. For him, It was an effort. His body was stiff, his limbs slow to respond. He knelt before the true cross and pressed his forehead into the sand. The wind moved across the plain ahead. Saladin's army still did not know what was coming. Baldwin prayed. Not for life, not for victory, but for the will to do what had to be done. Those around him saw their king, a leper teenager, kneeling in the sand, trembling with exhaustion and fever, preparing to lead them into what all knew might be death. No one laughed. No one spoke. Some wept. Then Baldwin stood. He was helped back onto his horse. The reins were still bound to his wrists. He did not speak much. He did not need to. His gaze, fixed straight ahead, was command enough. Attack! The Frankish knights began to accelerate, first at a trot, then faster, then a full gallop. The ground shook beneath hundreds of hooves. Long lances were lowered, locked beneath arms. This was no longer men and horses. It was mass and momentum. This was the raw physics of medieval war. A heavily armored Frankish knight, mounted on a great war horse, could weigh over a ton at full charge. When the lance struck, the force did not come from the rider's arm. It came from the full weight and speed of the horse. That force was concentrated onto a point no larger than a coin at the lance tip. Anything in front of them shattered. The blow crashed straight into the flank of Saladin's army. The first soldiers hit did not even understand what was happening. They wore no armor. They were not mounted. They were walking, resting, standing. The impact was not combat. It was collision. Men were hurled aside. Bones broke. Horses fell. Formations collapsed in seconds. Screams erupted. Alarm horns sounded too late. Panic spread faster than any command. Baldwin was at the very front. He could not control his horse like a healthy warrior, but he was there. Among the Templars, he plunged into the enemy ranks, held upright by straps and absolute concentration. His presence there changed everything. Those behind him were no longer fighting for an abstract kingdom. They were fighting for the king in front of them, bleeding without feeling pain. The Knights Templar, under Odo of Saint Amand, did not scatter. They held formation. They did not stop to kill one man at a time. They ripped through the army like a saw, driving straight towards the center where Saladin's banner stood. Saladin recognized the danger too late. He tried to gather the Mamluks. These elite warriors mounted quickly, forming a protective ring around the Sultan. This was the fiercest fighting of the Battle of Montgisard. Surprise was gone. Loose formations were gone. Only steel against steel remained, but the terrain betrayed Saladin. Supply wagons, livestock, and fleeing crowds blocked every avenue of retreat. The army of 26,000 became a mass trapped in confined space. Numbers, once strength, turned into burden. In that chaos, numerical advantage vanished. The battle did not last hours. It lasted 20 minutes. 20 minutes in which Saladin's army was torn apart from within, not because they were weak, but because they were struck at the worst possible moment, in the worst possible place, by men who had nothing left to lose. The Mamluks fought to the end. They held the ring, sacrificing themselves one by one to create an escape. At last, the circle opened long enough for Saladin to flee. He did not withdraw in order. He ran. The great Sultan leapt onto a racing camel fast, light abandoning his war horse, abandoning his camp, abandoning his army. When Saladin vanished from the field, the spirit of his army collapsed completely. What followed was no longer a battle. It was a rout. 500 cavalry had done the impossible. They did not defeat 26,000 with strength. They broke them with timing, terrain, speed, and a single blow delivered at exactly the right moment. Montgisard was not a miracle. It was the moment when every mistake, every underestimation, and every decision that had seemed reasonable to Saladin converged and was crushed in 20 irreversible minutes. Saladin left Montgisard not as a commander withdrawing from a battlefield, but as a man fleeing from death. His magnificent war horse was abandoned. In the chaos, he was forced to leap onto a racing camel, an animal built for speed and survival, not for glory. It was not the mount of a victorious sultan. It was the mount of someone who needed to stay alive for a few more minutes. He did not look back. Behind Saladin, the army of 26,000, the force once believed to be unstoppable, collapsed the moment the one man who could hold it together vanished from sight. In medieval warfare, the most dangerous moment is not when two formations collide, but when one side begins to run. At Montgisard, that flight began almost instantly. There were no orders, no formations, no will to fight. The surviving soldiers turned and fled in every direction, crashing into one another, trampling each other underfoot, trying to escape what only minutes earlier had been a small group of cavalry. Roads clogged with supply wagons, stolen livestock, and tents that had never been packed away. Every obstacle became a trap, and in ancient warfare, the true slaughter always begins after the battle is over. The Frankish knights, exhausted and spent, continued the pursuit, not out of hatred, but because they understood that if the enemy regrouped, everything they had just achieved would mean nothing. They hunted down panicked groups of soldiers, cut down those who lagged behind, and turned the retreat into a river of blood and bodies. But Montgisard did not end there. As night fell, the weather turned. Rain began to fall, not the gentle rain of the Mediterranean, but cold, cutting downpours, carrying the chill of the approaching winter. For an army retreating in order, it would have been harsh. For a shattered mass without food, water, or direction, it was a death sentence. Many of Saladin's soldiers had discarded their armor to run faster. In the cold rain, they shivered, collapsed from exhaustion, and lost their way in a desert that showed no mercy. There were no tents, no fires, no commanders. They died of cold, of thirst, of sheer exhaustion, deaths without glory, without witnesses. Then another enemy appeared. The Bedouin tribes, who had earlier been bribed or cowed by Saladin's power, saw an opportunity. As news of the disaster spread, they no longer saw the Egyptian army as an invincible war machine. They saw lost men, weak men, carrying weapons and valuables. For days after Montgisard, the desert became a hunting ground. Bedouin bands emerged from the darkness, striking isolated groups, looting, killing, then vanishing again. The wounded, the exhausted, those who could no longer run were stripped of everything and left in the cold rain. Death came slowly, but inevitably. Saladin himself, once ruler of an empire stretching from the Nile to Syria, fared little better than his soldiers. He fled without rest. No tents, no great retinue, no hot meals. He drank from muddy pools. He watched those closest to him collapse from exhaustion and sickness. At times, rumors spread that he was already dead. When Saladin finally reached Egypt, he did not return as a conqueror. He returned like a ghost. Cairo fell into mourning before the Sultan even appeared. Whispers spread that the great army had been annihilated, that a miracle had favored the enemy. The numbers told the story of the 26,000 men who had crossed the border into the kingdom of Jerusalem. Only about 10% survived to return to Egypt. Most did not die in the 20 minutes at Montgisard. They died in the days that followed on the road of flight, in the cold rain, under the blades of those who had once bowed before them. Montgisard was not merely a defeat, it was the destruction of a myth, the myth of the invincible army, the myth of absolute certainty, the myth that strength in numbers always decide the outcome. In a few short hours, All of it was crushed not by a larger force, but by a perfectly timed blow, delivered by men who had nothing left to lose. Saladin survived. His empire, though badly wounded, endured, but what never returned was the sense of invulnerability. From Montgisard onward, every decision he made carried the memory of an afternoon in the desert, where a leper king and 500 cavalry had forced a massive army to run. The war was not over, but the world was no longer the same. Baldwin returned to Jerusalem not like a king. He returned like a walking miracle. News of Montgisard traveled faster than any army. It crossed deserts, passed over seas, and reached European courts and Eastern churches carrying the same unbelievable story. 500 men had shattered 26,000. A leper king had done what even the greatest Christian armies would never manage again. When Baldwin rode through the gates of Jerusalem, church bells rang without pause. The people poured into the streets, reaching to touch his cloak as if he were a living relic. In their eyes, this was not merely a military victory. It was proof that God had not abandoned Jerusalem. They did not see the blood-soaked bandages beneath his armor. They did not see a body pushed beyond its biological limits. They saw only victory, but that victory carried a price that only Baldwin paid immediately. The march, the battle, the heat, the exhaustion, all of it took the last thing his body still possessed. When the euphoria of triumph faded, leprosy advanced faster than ever. The remaining nerves continued to die. Numbness spread. Wounds refused to heal. Fevers lingered. Baldwin had spent his own life to buy time for the kingdom, and that time was short. In the years after Montgisard, he continued to rule, but each year marked another retreat of the body. He lost his sight. The world slowly sank into darkness. The hands once bound to the reins could no longer hold them. His legs could no longer support him for long. He had to be guided, then carried, but he was still king, even when he could no longer ride. Baldwin appeared with the army. Once, during Saladin's siege of Kerak, Baldwin was carried to the battlefield on a litter suspended between two horses. Merely hearing that Baldwin was present was enough for Saladin to withdraw, not because he feared Jerusalem's army, but because he feared Baldwin. Throughout his life, Saladin faced many Christian leaders, men healthier, stronger, commanding larger forces, but only one made him truly cautious, not because of tactics, not because of numbers, but because of spirit, the king who had once forced him to flee on a camel. But spirit cannot keep a body alive forever. In 1185, Baldwin IV died at the age of 24. When he died, what had kept Jerusalem standing for nearly a decade died with him. Not an army, not walls, but the will of a man who had accepted death early and therefore never feared it. After Baldwin, the kingdom quickly fell into the hands of men with stronger bodies but weaker vision. They quarreled. They provoked Saladin. They shattered the fragile understandings Baldwin had maintained with his own failing existence. Just 2 years later, at Hattin, Jerusalem lost everything. The army was destroyed. The true cross was captured. And soon after, the holy city surrendered. The miracle did not repeat itself. Montgisard was a singular moment in history, a moment where will overcame numbers, where a man with nothing left to lose defeated the logic of an empire. But history does not run on miracles. It runs on endurance, organization, and time. Baldwin bought time with his life, and the kingdom spent it. The story of Montgisard is not the story of an eternal victory. It is a harsh reminder that there are individuals capable of the impossible, but even they cannot defeat fate forever. Baldwin IV did not save Jerusalem's future, but for one afternoon in the desert, he forced the world to remember this. When a man has already accepted death, no empire can make him bow, and that is both the cost and the meaning of victory.